Professor Zuber-Skerritt, convener of the third postgraduate research and supervision program funded by the Federal Department of Employment, Education and Training, Australia. Professor Zuber-Skerritt introduces this video program.
The videos are based on recordings of a staff development program for supervisors of postgraduate students in the newly amalgamated university campuses. This program was held at the Hyatt Regency on the Gold Coast of Queensland in Australia in September 1995. New university campuses, established since 1987, have experienced many exciting challenges. These can be observed in at least 4 areas. 1. Staff facing the transition from a purely teaching role to the responsibilities as researchers and teachers of postgraduate research students. 2. Staff having to teach increasing numbers of postgraduate students with reduced resources. This has often led to increased staff workload and stress. 3. Universities facing increasing accountability to research students, society, employers and taxpayers. All these stakeholders have a legitimate right to expect this accountability in terms of quality outcomes and cost effectiveness. 4. Staff being expected to upgrade their academic qualifications through PhD studies, while at the same time having to supervise postgraduate research students. How then can we assist the new university campuses in further improving the quality of postgraduate education and fostering an institutional research culture? This video series and accompanying written materials aim, first, to improve the quality of university teaching and learning at the postgraduate level in the new university campuses. 2, to develop postgraduate supervision skills in a way which will achieve a multiplier effect in each institution. 3, to provide support materials, of which these videos are a part, and which can be used by the participants and others in their own institutions. 4, to address existing and new issues in postgraduate supervision and generate solutions to these problems from the participants themselves, in conjunction with national and international leaders in this field. I hope you will appreciate the following video.
What we're now to proceed on is a workshop dealing with establishing a research culture, responsibilities and code of practice. So we have a range of topics to deal with. The way in which we're going to proceed with it is that I will give a brief presentation up front just to give an outline of some of the key policy issues, and in particular to share with you some of the policies and practices that have been put in place at one of the universities participating in this workshop, and then to ask you to reconvene your groups to look at one of 3 key issues for you to discuss, and then to report back to the group the outcome of those in terms of the responsibilities that you have as either supervisors or as students of research postgraduate training programs. Essentially, the outline of the presentation is focused on five topics. One is the topic of research culture as a concept, which I'll talk briefly about. Secondly, to discuss briefly features of successful research environments, which of course we're all interested in either maintaining, enhancing or establishing. Thirdly, the issue of code of practice for maintaining and monitoring academic quality. We all have our own as universities, but what are the salient features of those, and do we have the glazed eye syndrome when we're looking at our codes of practice, or are they actually implemented within our universities? Fourthly, the issue of minimum standards of facilities and support for research postgraduate students. What is the quality of that support within our organisations? Is it adequate? what steps are being taken to enhance them. And finally, the issue of co-supervision. I want to raise some issues about the sole supervisor, the person who acts as the supervisor and the student acts as an apprentice. And there is this famous one-to-one relationship built up. Is that a good practice, or is it useful to actually look at some alternatives there? And I think our university, and I think a number of other universities represented here, are now looking at co-supervision, or indeed extending supervision into a small team associated with research postgraduate students. And then finally, to move into the workshop situation for you to look at some questions and report back on those. Okay, the issue of a research culture. What is the research culture? When somebody says, let's say within the Faculty of Science and Technology or the School of Molecular Sciences at James Cook University, there's a wonderful research culture there. What does that term actually mean? Professor Peter Sheehan gave, I think, a very nice talk last year at this equivalent presentation about the meaning of research culture, how that term has developed and how it is interpreted in our context. The term itself is of course highly dependent upon the mix of academic disciplines. As a scientist, I have a certain understanding about the term research culture. When I visit a research institution that has perhaps, say, 60 PhD postdoctoral staff and might have double that number in PhD students, and you say, oh yes, that's got a wonderful research culture, what does that mean? And I think what we need to do as a group here today is to try and interpret the meaning of research culture in our own academic context, in the context of our own schools, if we're located in disciplinary departments, what that means in our department, what it means in terms of the nature of specific expertise that is needed in order to have an adequate or a good research culture within that environment, and is the issue of size of the academic organisational unit. Obviously, if one's talking about the research culture of a relatively small research group, what does that mean? And then you move on to the next level, say at the departmental level, at the faculty level, and of course at the university level. We need to look at what that term research culture actually means. But I think what it fundamentally means to the student is that the student feels comfortable with the environment in which they're operating to undertake their research postgraduate training work. As a Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, I'm very keen for my university to have a supportive research culture and research environment. And one way of examining that or describing that is by way of saying that the university overall has a sense of shared research values that place normative pressures on members of the research group, the research school, or the university overall. So what are those shared research values, and what sorts of normative pressures are being placed on members of the university? If we look at the more functional level, what the term research culture means, then we can describe it in a number of ways. First of all, effective means of research information exchange, a systematic approach to research funding, a familiarity with current research literature, and adequacy of research environment and support. So those are functional, if you like, definitions of research culture that I think apply across all areas of university work. And what I wanted to do during the course of this workshop here today is to try to get down to the nitty-gritty of some of these matters relating to adequacy of research culture. The first point to deal with is to look at some of the features of successful research environments. And that is the mission, the goal and objectives of the university's academic organisational unit and group. That the researchers are actually functioning in a supportive environment, and that the policies and practices that exist within the university are a whole are consistent with a successful research culture, and that people individuals operating within that research culture feel as though they're part of the system. Secondly, there need to be supportive research and research postgraduate training policies. A third aspect is to do with effective staff development programs and reward mechanisms. Just to give you an example of that, we were looking at staff promotion policies at Griffith University about 3 or 4 years ago. On looking at those closely, there was nothing in there about the effectiveness of supervision of postgraduate students as being one of the criteria for promotion. So what we were saying is that you've got to be a good supervisor, but we didn't have anything in there that actually rewarded staff for being good supervisors. So now that policy has been changed, and it's now embedded within the system such that being a good supervisor, generating good research postgraduate students has become one of a number of the criteria for promotion, not only under research, but also under teaching, because we all know how the role of teaching is being increased within the university in a quality sense. So research postgraduate supervision actually should be covered under criteria for promotion under both teaching and research. Empowerment of research groups. This comes down to the devolution of responsibility in research postgraduate programs. Then we come to the issue of adequacy of facilities and support. If we're going to enrol more and more postgraduate students, we can't be put in a position such that we're not providing them with support. The sixth issue relates to a culture of competitive applications for grants and scholarships. We all know that there's not enough scholarships to go around. If you're going to have a good research culture within your environment, then I think you need to have effective mechanisms for applying for grants and also applying for scholarships for your students. In addition to that, the students also need to have support in terms of part-time employment. What is the size and diversity of the group that is required in order to develop an adequate research culture for research postgraduate training such that you don't have a lone student trying to interact with a lone supervisor in a very lonely research environment? Effective research leadership. Once again, one of these terms that is difficult to define, research leadership. Access to major research developments, relevant meetings and leaders in the field. Okay, here we're talking about getting students and supervisors, of course, to relevant conferences, both national and international. That has to be incorporated into any plan for enhancing research postgraduate training on your campuses. A culture of publishing in quality journals with quality publishers. That to me is an important performance indicator of an effective research environment, effective research group. Willingness to collaborate where appropriate, especially relevant in multidisciplinary areas or when needed access needed to industry, government agencies and clinical environments. Very important in some of the more applied research postgraduate training program areas. Just to give you one example, I'm a biomedical researcher, but I operate in a university that lacks a medical school. In order to have credibility in biomedical research, one needs to ensure that your PhD programs fit in with potential clinical environments. And finally, internationalisation. Universities see themselves as being international sites of learning, of teaching, research and research postgraduate training. And the way in which this can be influenced is by trying to get international visitors to visit your campus. To have that as part of a department, a faculty, a school strategy. I now want to deal with the issue of code of practice. I think we all have our own codes of practice within our universities. I just want to focus on the salient features. First of all, the codes of practice needs to be interpreted at several levels. University, faculty, supervisors and staff. The university itself has major responsibilities in a number of areas, but it needs to be such that it provides the appropriate environment for a code of practice which is obviously supporting quality research postgraduate training. Issues of entry standards, ensuring that students who are enrolled have the appropriate qualifications, experience. If they don't, set up mechanisms such that they can attain them, because otherwise you can disenfranchise whole groups of people. Very early on at Griffith we found that in humanities we weren't attracting sufficient women into our humanities programs. And the Faculty of Humanities introduced a Master of Arts program in Women's Studies, which had a very significant research component, which then attracted mature women into that course, and now the Faculty of Humanities has the third largest research higher degree program within the university, starting from a small base about 7 or 8 years ago. And this has been due, I think, at least in part, into enfranchising new populations of potential students out there by way of ensuring that you're maintaining your entry standards, but where you are providing for specific courses, such as master's programs that then articulated effectively into research higher degrees. Responsibilities of the faculties. As I've indicated earlier, in my view it's important for faculties to have individuals who have designated responsibilities for research postgraduate training work, such that the buck actually stops somewhere within the faculty, that the student isn't pushed around from pillar to post, but there is a designated person responsible for research postgraduate training. Setting up an effective induction program. What happens when the student turns up? Students don't turn up in February, they turn up in every month throughout the year for research higher degree programs. When the student turns up, do they just waft around for a while and left to the supervisor by themselves, or do they have an induction program? And in my view, there needs to be an induction program for every student that comes to the university. Obviously the supervisor, obviously the Deputy Dean Research, and preferably also an administrative person who's familiar with the nuts and bolts. How do they get access to photocopying, interlibrary loans and all the rest of it? Where's the access to email? Most importantly, of course, the role of the supervisor is to act as the mentor and a close colleague with the research postgraduate student, to negotiate up front issues such as contact, feedback, progress, project advice, the frequency of providing that, written work on an agreed schedule, feedback on drafts, advice on examiners. But going beyond that, there is also responsibilities for the supervisor in requesting grants and scholarships, assisting and advising on issues relating to ethics and intellectual property, and then beyond that, advice on future employment and career development prospects and assistance with part-time employment. All of these things are part of the research culture that needs to occur, I think, in supporting research postgraduate students. And finally, the students themselves. The students need to have a view that they are there also to fulfil certain responsibilities. Familiarity with university policies. Keeping to negotiated and agreed schedules of contact. Taking initiative in raising problems, not to stew away with problems in their own mind because they feel that nobody's going to listen to them. But if you have a point of contact for the faculty in addition to that of the supervisor, then there is an avenue for them to raise those problems earlier rather than later when there's a chaos situation. Providing reports, etc. A number of responsibilities that the student needs to be able to conduct. Then we come to the issue of resources, facilities and other support provided for higher degree students. What we've done is to establish what we call a minimum standard of facilities and support for research postgraduate students. Now, I can't stand here and put the hand on the heart and say Griffith University provides those facilities and support for every PhD and master's student. We don't. In the Faculty of Humanities at Griffith we have, I think, 64 PhD students with enough desks to accommodate about 20 odd. But we do have a strategy in place which is going to address those issues. Physical facilities, financial assistance, participation in faculty research culture, other resources and support, and induction. Those are the sort of the 5 key areas of minimum standards. We focused on full-time PhD students as our baseline, And there are certain things that we want to achieve by the end of next year. What I'd like to do now is to ask you, instead of listening to me, to become involved in some of these key questions about research culture.